The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Our guest tonight is Dr. Roshan Perera, Senior Research Fellow, Advocata Institute. Good evening and welcome, Dr. Roshan.
Thank you very much for having me on this program.
Absolutely wonderful to have you here with us to help us understand Budget 2024 and what exactly it entails, given that this time around we're under an IMF program, we have to also focus on debt restructuring, macro stability. So speak to us about what the budgeting process entails, because it is quite complex and nuanced.
Yes, thank you for that question, and I think that is a relevant question, a very for this at this current juncture, because we're going into a budget at least presentation of budget 2024. But actually, when we look at a budget, we have to look at it in terms of, a budget is really part of a longer term. It has a longer term focus, really. It's very similar to, say, a corporate a company that presents, they look at they have a medium term strategic plan, and within that they encompass their annual budgeting process. So government really also has to do a similar exercise. They have a medium term, what we call a fiscal framework, where they have some, an overall program that they wish to, where the country needs to go in terms of the fiscal sector, in terms of the overall macroeconomic environment. And the annual budget is really fits in to this medium-term macroeconomic framework. But when you talk about the budget cycle has several elements to it. So first is actually it's developed within this fiscal framework.
Right.
And in Sri Lanka, actually, you quite rightly said, we have to look at it now currently because we are in this IMF program, and the IMF also has certain targets for the 4-year program. But it also has to be aligned with the debt restructuring exercise, because that is part of the whole exercise that we are undertaking to come back into some kind of stability. But we also have a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was passed in Parliament in 2003, and under that act there are certain fiscal targets that are set. So really this entire the budget and our fiscal program should be aligned with within this framework. So that is the first part of it. The second really is the whole budget cycle and the preparation of the budget, which we are more familiar with, and we know how the ministries have to submit to their expenditure estimates. And then the Ministry of Finance puts it together and tries to see how they can match it with the resources that they have. So that is the second part of it, the budget preparation, and then the submission of the budget itself. We know it's done by the Minister of Finance, and then the budget estimates. So that's the second part. The third part is actually the implementation of the budget, and then finally, of course, the whole auditing and the the control environment, and making sure that the budget has actually or the expenditure and revenue generation of the government is in line with the budget.
Right.
Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, we focus a lot on that, the budget speech and the budget preparation and the estimates. But there's very little emphasis on the next two parts, which I talked about, the budget implementation. And if you look at, consecutive budgets, you'll see that although the government, announces certain policies, the implementation is very weak. And I think Verite has done they do a budget tracker, and they track the implementation of the budget process. And you'll see that annually, I mean, if you take, several budgets of the past, the implementation is very weak. And that's because there's not a lot of focus on that, and also on the control side. Are they actually, the expenditure, is it aligned with this overall macroeconomic framework we're talking about? And in terms of even the revenue generation, is it based on what they budgeted, or is it some other, ad hoc revenue generation measures that are implemented just so that we can, patch the budget? So that is the process. But as I said, more emphasis needs to be placed on the last two parts of this budgeting process.
This year, Dr. Roshan, how does it differ from previous years, given that we are in a unique situation?
Yeah. So generally, I mean, a budget or a budget is prepared within, as I said, some kind of overall framework. First thing is, of course, the fiscal policy, which is announced through this budget, is for macro stabilization. We are trying to make sure that the economy is stabilized. So if you have low growth, then you might have a more stimulus through the budget, because you're trying to stimulate growth. But if you have other macroeconomic imbalances, you have to adjust the budget so that you're able to bring the economy back into kind of a stable environment. So first thing is, of course, you have to make sure that the fiscal policy is targeted towards macro stability and growth. And then for that, actually, we have to have sort of more kind of a longer term considerations. We need to think of whether we are spending within our means, making sure that it's a sustainable budget, and things like that. And in this current context, as I said, it has to be aligned with the IMF's target. So I think when we are evaluating the next budget, we must make sure that we can ensure that these targets that are set with the IMF can be realized through the budgetary measures that are announced.
So just last month, the first review of the IMF was concluded, and although the government had met its primary deficit targets, it fell short of its revenue targets. What's the significance of this, and what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, so Sri Lanka has had a very poor record in terms of revenue collection. In the 1990s, our revenue collection, which we measure against our GDP, was something like 20% of our GDP. We were collecting in terms of revenue. This has fallen to somewhere near 7% in 2022. It was something close to 7%, just over 7%. So consistently, our revenue collection has been falling, and there are many reasons for that shortfall. We have had, ad hoc policy changes. There is no consistency in terms of tax policies. We have given far too many tax incentives. So if you look at the corporate tax collection, it is concentrated in a very few sectors, because there are large parts of the economy which have been given incentives and they are outside this tax net. Similar in other taxes as well. These large the high number of exemptions that are given, even in terms of the value added tax, has completely eroded the tax base. So if we want to put this right, we have to address all these issues. Apart from that, it will not be possible to collect the kind of revenue that we need to put the fiscal sector back on track. But that is on the policy side. But we also have issues with tax administration, and I think that was highlighted by in the various reports that have been published recently, that there has been weak tax administration, and that really one way in which we can address that is, the revenue agencies have to be made more accountable for tax collection. And that based on the revenue targets that have been given. So there needs to be more accountability and responsibility on the part of the the collecting agencies. But also, I think the systems need to be put in place. So in many countries, revenue collection has improved dramatically with the whole digitalization of the economy.
Of course.
Because when you have one is a unique digital ID. If you have a unique digital ID, you can track individuals. You can link basically their tax files with their bank accounts, their salaries, whatever they are getting from their employers. You can link it to whatever assets they own. So that if it's linked to a land registry or your motor vehicle registry, all that can be connected, which means that it will be very difficult to evade taxes. So I think that is one thing that can be done, and the other one is also making the economy. We are very much a cash-based economy, so it's very difficult when you try to collect value-added taxes, and it's a cash-based economy. It's very difficult to track the transactions.
Right.
But if you make it much more digitalized and you have these electronic payments, it will be much easier to track payments, and then easier to tax. And this has been done in other countries. I mean, India is a classic example where they've managed to dramatically improve tax collection just through the digitalization.
Right. Speaking of taxation, that is not the only way to increase a country's revenue. However, we see a lot of discontentment among the public due to the harsh austerity measures that the government was compelled to take in this present backdrop. How sustainable is it to keep taxing the people of the country?
Yeah, so I think again, to go back to this tax issue, there are two things. So one is actually you can't keep taxing the same people. You have to widen the tax base or the tax net, and that's what I was talking about. You have to bring in this, this like large informal sector, which is very difficult to capture because of this whole cash economy. So that's one way in bringing them into the tax net, and the other one I said was where there are lots of incentives being given, and there are certain sections of the economy which are excluded from paying taxes. So I think that's one thing, so that you don't tax, you don't excessively tax certain segments of the economy or certain segments of society. That's one. But I think we can't only focus on the tax side.
Yeah.
I think there has to be much greater emphasis or focus on expenditure rationalization. If you look at the budget estimates or the appropriation bill for 2024 have just been released, and if you look at that, I mean, you still see the same segments or same ministries with very high allocations. So defense is one. They still have one of the highest allocations for expenditure, apart from the Ministry of Finance. But Ministry of Finance does other things, so that's a different entity. But defense is still one of the highest allocations in terms of the budget. So what kind of rationalization has gone in there? The secondly is in terms of salaries and wages. We know that a large proportion of the revenue gets eaten up by salaries, wages and pensions. Now, what kind of public sector reform has happened in the last year? Since the crisis to now, we know that this is a large component, but there's been very little actual on the ground rationalization of those expenditures. So those things have to happen. Of course, we have had interest expenditure has, if you look at the estimates, takes a large chunk of the expenditure goes to interest payments. That is a contractual obligation that we can't not pay those. Of course, we're trying to reduce it by this debt restructuring, or at least extend the repayment period. But we'll have to pay it at some point. But the same kind of exercise needs to be done on these other expenditures as well. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable, because we can't keep, as you said, keep increasing revenue. There has to be some kind of expenditure management as well, if we are to bring the budget deficits within these targets that we're talking about.
I think people are also sick of hearing about this whole trope of reforming the public sector when it isn't happening. State-owned enterprises which are eating at state funds. So what needs to happen? Who needs to initiate it, Dr. Roshan?
So in terms of the public sector, public sector reform, I think it's the government has to take the bull by the horns. They have to assess, because we have a huge pool of labor, but a lot of it is idling, and if you look at the rest of the economy, they are actually there was labor shortage in many sectors of the economy. So we need I mean, there really needs to be some kind of rationalization and move some of this labor out into the other parts of the economy. But of course, within government also, you have certain areas where there's excess labor and shortfall. But that kind of study to identify where the shortfalls are, where the excess is, and try to, bridge those, has not been undertaken. As far as, to my knowledge, that kind of exercise has not been done. I mean, given that we have gone through this very severe crisis, this is one thing that there must be a committee or something, some body that is given the responsibility to undertake this exercise. We've done this in the past. We've had commissions looking at salary revisions and these public sector reforms, but in this crisis we have not done that. On the SOE front, I have to say that there has been some progress. I mean, we are seeing some progress. We've seen some of the SOEs that were announced in the last year's budget. Now they are calling for expressions of interest on that. But of course, in some areas it has been slow, particularly in terms of the establishment of this holding company, because that holding company, where many of the SOEs are going to be parked, will improve the governance of those SOEs, because that's one of the biggest issues, right, in terms of these SOEs, in terms of the leakage, in terms of the expenditure, the burden it places on the fiscal. So that holding company structure has to be established soon, so that these SOEs can be brought in there and that the governance improved in terms of those.
I'd like to draw your attention to one important sector, which is education, and the abysmal budgetary allocation to education. I mean, this has been going on for years and years to no avail. What kind of advocacy work can we the citizens do ahead of the budget?
So I think in terms of education, I think we need to be clear what kind of a labor force we want to create. I mean, what is the objective of education, right? We educate the public for a particular end. So we need to understand that and then develop the education, the whole system has to be in relation to that, right? And then you have to decide where do you want to put your money, where are you going to get the most out of the money that you put in, and the evidence in the rest of the world is that it's for primary education or preschool education. Primary education is where the biggest and secondary education is probably where the biggest gains are. But then if you look at the allocations in the budget, I mean, where are the allocations? So this kind of very granular analysis needs to be done, because now what's happening is the budget is taken, the last year's budget is taken, and you just increase it by for inflation, and that's the allocation for this year. But I don't know whether there is a granular analysis that is taken to against some kind of outcomes,
that's
objectives.
Crazy.
That those outcomes need to be there. So that again is the problem with the kind of budgeting exercise we do. We have all these expenditures and revenues, but we don't necessarily have any outcomes to match them against. So do these expenditures actually achieve those outcomes or objectives, and who is monitoring that?
Who is monitoring it? I mean, we need to pay our teachers, right?
Exactly. So I think these are the part of the budgeting process I told you that we don't really pay attention to in terms of the implementation and then the auditing of the budget or how much has been spent, whether it has really met the needs or met the objectives for which we actually have allocated those expenditure. So I think that is one thing that has been done, particularly in the large items, where because defense, education, health, the budgets are still very large comparatively. So I think that kind of analysis needs to be done to ensure that the money goes to where it's needed most and benefits those who really need it most. Otherwise, we're just just throwing money.
Dr. Roshan, I'm just trying to understand. So, the budget is a very top-down process, right? Where the budget is devised and presented, and we listen to it, and then we switch off our TVs and move on with our lives, right?
Well, that shouldn't be, and I think now hopefully people's attitudes towards the budget have changed somewhat, because now they can feel it in their purses, because they can feel it because they are paying taxes, their taxes are biting, so they are more conscious about where this money is going. So I'm hoping that people become more educated to hold the governments accountable in terms of keeping them accountable on where this money, how this money is being spent, and that, in a sense, is where taxation is a great sort of form of it forms this social contract, because people will pay taxes only if they know that the money that is being collected is spent in a way that improves the welfare of everybody or the society, right? Otherwise, why would they pay taxes? So I think that is a really important aspect of taxation and the role of the citizen, actually.
Yeah, but there is a massive gap, a massive disconnect between the fact that we pay taxes and that tax money is actually put to good use.
Absolutely. So I think that is where our responsibility as citizens also comes in, that we need to be much more hold our governments more accountable for how they use the money that they're collecting, I think that's where the budgeting or our interest in the budget should not end with that budget speech that we hear in November. We should continue to monitor. And I think civil society is now much more aware of that and has been doing a much better job at monitoring the progress of the implementation of the budget and whether it is in line with the overall policies of the government. But I think even citizens need to do that, and also, as you said, it has been up to now a top-down approach, but really it has to be a bottom-up approach, because how do you identify what you should spend on? That should come from the bottom, right? Because the people, the society, only understands what the needs are of those societies. So it should be a bottom-up approach. Although we have made it, it has been a top-down approach.
Dr. Roshan, in the recent past, two diagnostic reports were released, governance diagnostic reports, one by civil society led by Transparency International Sri Lanka, and the second by IMF. Just before concluding the conversation, could you take us through some of the recommendations and findings in the reports collectively with respect to the fiscal aspects?
Yeah, so I think they have it's a very comprehensive report. I think both reports are very cover many areas, but since we're talking about the fiscal, and if we narrow it to the fiscal, I think they look at all the aspects. So in terms of tax collection, they look at how taxes have been collected and how that has led to certain corrupt practices, which have as a result, the tax collection itself has been suffered because of those practices. Because basically there are a lot of ad hoc taxes that can be introduced at the discretion of the minister. So those are some things that they have said that needs to change. Secondly, of course, they've also identified, the weak administration or the certain, the sort of corrupt practices within the revenue agencies themselves. Because of this, there's too much of the contact between the taxpayer and the tax officials. And the thing is to sort of to minimize that contact as much as possible, so that it can be driven totally or as much as possible through technology. So there are ways in which you can improve those, and I think those are some things that they have identified. But on the expenditure side as well, they have some recommendations, particularly in terms of how particularly these public investment programs, and that has been a huge issue for us in the past, in terms of the type of public investment programs that have been undertaken. What was the rationale? What was the justification? Was it within this whole public investment program a national public investment program that we had? And how have they been chosen? So the whole thing of unsolicited proposals that have been accepted. So all those things have been addressed in this, plus the whole thing of procurements. And I think this has been an issue, and the transparency of procurements, because I think there has been always a case for having it very a transparent process, but it's still very opaque. So I think those are some areas, and one hopes that I would say that some of these recommendations that they have made in the governance diagnostic report should actually form part of this program, the IMF program, so that we ensure that some of these things are introduced as we go along in the next 4 years. Of course, we can't do this overnight, but some things can be done, so that we hold the government accountable to introducing some of these things.
Okay, fantastic. And that's a fantastic note to end the show on, holding to account the government. Thank you so much for your time, your perspectives, and for sharing your expertise, Dr. Roshan Perera. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next week with another edition of the program. Have a safe weekend. Good night.